Hello and welcome to this um, catch-up recording for training day 1 of year 1, and it's all about interpretation in the classroom. And I'm Sarah Garcia de Bustos, the head of subject, and I'm going to be taking you through this slide deck. So welcome to session 1. We're going to be talking about what it means to take a hermeneutical approach to teaching RE and why we might do it. And for this, you'll need to have resource 1, the Bowie findings report, to hand, and that's on Brightspace. Now, over the course of the year, each of our training days will focus on disciplinary knowledge. We're going to be starting with hermeneutics, but before we get into it, it's worth reminding ourselves why we've selected these 3 disciplines to focus on. After all, we know disciplinary knowledge is still contested in the RE community, and some of you may be teaching in schools that aren't teaching a theology, philosophy, social sciences style curriculum. So why then have we opted for it? Because we agree with what thinkers like George Ewan Wright say about the combination of these 3 disciplines making the greatest difference in pupils' religious literacy. Remember that according to Wright, being religiously literate is to reflect, communicate and act in an informed, intelligent and sensitive manner towards the phenomenon of religion. Religious literacy lies at the heart of RE at Teach First social justice mission. So let's refresh our memories on that now. Your self-study session included questions to consider in preparation for today. And I've included the original questions on the screen for your reference, and hopefully you'll have your notes on these to hand as you listen to the recording. In the session, we took some time to share reflections on this chapter with groups. Now, obviously you can't do that now, but maybe just pause, have a read over your notes, and consider whether this is something you'd like to discuss with your peers. And we then had a feedback session. Obviously, we can't do that in a recording, but again, I'd encourage you to talk about what you've read with your peers and also your SDL during your next interaction. Before we look at teaching RE through a theological lens, let's consider how pedagogical approaches, disciplinary lenses, and methods and tools all fit together. This is worth taking some time to think through properly now, as in your Module 1 assignment, you'll need to explain your choice of strategy. And by that, we mean the practical thing you're doing in the classroom in relation to a broader vision for RE and theoretical framework. Now, we know beginner teachers in RE can sometimes find this confusing, as do many experienced colleagues. So let's try to unpick things a little now. Within the RE community and literature, we use pedagogy in a very particular way. Very simply, a pedagogy refers to the method and practices of a teacher. It's how they approach their teaching style and relates to the different theories they use, how they give feedback, and the assessments they set. When people refer to the pedagogy of teaching, it means how the teacher delivers the curriculum to the class. Often, the teacher's pedagogical approach is driven or determined by their conscious or unconscious educational philosophy, or their vision of the grander purpose of education, their understanding of how learning happens, and the context in which they teach. For example, if a teacher has an educational philosophy that maintains young people should be the agents of their own learning so they can nurture individual talents, believes the learning process is complex and individual, and works in a school which has ample resources, the teacher will probably, either consciously or unconsciously, choose pedagogical approaches which reflect this and meet the needs of the pupils in their school. When we talk about RE pedagogies, we're usually referring to big, overarching approaches to teaching that are governed by very different ideas about the purpose of the subject. Outside of RE, pedagogies might be used to refer to what is the bottom level of this diagram, and we'll be coming back to this level later. If you remember from topic 7 in Summer Institute, there are lots of possible RE pedagogical approaches. On the diagram here, there's just 2 for illustrative purposes. A few of these RE pedagogies, like CRE, which we'll mention again later, are more practical in laying out their vision. As well as discussing the purpose they have for RE and how they think the subject should be taught in theory, they go into depth about the substantive and disciplinary knowledge that they think should be taught, and they detail specific strategies they consider to be the most useful for teaching these. But many RE pedagogies are much less classroom focused and are quite difficult to translate into practical strategies. That's one reason why these RE specific pedagogies take up so little space in the 2021 Ofsted Literature Review. Ofsted are concerned with impact in the classroom and not theoretical debate. The disciplinary lenses sit underneath the pedagogies because they tell us how to know about religion and non-religion. What questions are we asking? What methods will we use to answer these questions? What skills do we need to develop? Because of their different views on the purpose of RE, different RE pedagogies will prioritise different lenses. Mostly this is implicit, as these RE pedagogies were often developed long before this more recent work on disciplinary knowledge and ways of knowing became standard. Some RE pedagogies prioritise just one disciplinary lens. For example, Robert Jackson's interpretive RE is a deliberate and at the time innovative privileging of the human and social sciences lens. Others prioritise more than one, as you can see here with CRE. Please note, this doesn't mean that you can only do theology and philosophy lenses through critical RE. This is just an example. Disciplinary methods are the skills, methods or processes used to study a curriculum's substantive knowledge. The ones on the diagram are suggestions only. Many more could be chosen under each disciplinary lens, and many are cross-disciplinary. So this level of the diagram has even more fluidity than the one above. For example, teaching pupils the skill of argument is important within theology, philosophy, and social sciences. However, it looks different in those disciplines at the secondary school level, and this is only beginning to be understood now. And then we have effective teaching strategies or tools, far removed from the why. These are the practical tools that support pupils to meet the learning objectives. Again, those shown here are just examples. A huge variety could be selected to teach each disciplinary method, depending on your context and understanding of how pupils learn. Some of these strategies will be useful to teachers in many subjects, for example, peel paragraphs or inference squares, while others, like dialogue, are more RE specific, although perhaps they do have the potential to be used in other subjects. But it's not a total free-for-all at this level. There will always be some connection between the specific tools or strategies you're using in the classroom and the high levels of the diagram. Your chosen strategies support your pupils to move towards the learning objectives, which are influenced by the skills and methods you want pupils to learn, which in turn are influenced by the disciplinary lens you've selected pupils to explore the substantive content through. And that lens choice will have been influenced by your pedagogical approach. This means that some strategies might end up being more closely associated with certain pedagogical approaches or completely inappropriate for use with others. In today's session, you're going to have an opportunity to explore the theological lens and one possible method of teaching through a theological lens, hermeneutics. Now that was a lot to take in, so at this point we'll have a quick understanding check. So read the question, pause it, and then in a second I'm going to reveal the answer, which is effective teaching strategies. And again, and again, and again. What you saw in that quick knowledge test on the previous slides was an example of assessment for learning, which is something you're going to be using in your classrooms, or maybe are already, I'm sure. So, what is hermeneutics? Well, it's the theory and practice of interpretation, especially of sacred texts, and we are going to be focusing on how we might use it to interpret sacred text today, but we're also going to be looking at some creative approaches. Just pause the recording here and think about your own experience of teaching sacred texts or using hermeneutics. Jot down what worked and what you think you might need to work on, because this will be useful to refer back to at a later date. And at this point, again, we ask for feedback, but please do contact your peers or your SDL if you'd like to talk about any of the notes that you've made. So if we return for a moment to our earlier diagram, this is a great explanatory tool, but we already saw that it's a little too simple given the fluidity at play on the lower level. In the context of today's learning, it's important to emphasize that while hermeneutical approaches are probably the most clearly understood and best theorized method in the theological disciplinary lens, there's a lot more to theology than hermeneutics. For example, experiential knowledge, which is knowledge that comes from religious experience, is an important aspect of theology too. It has its own set of teaching strategies or tools, although these are much more contested in terms of how efficient they are and the impact they have, and we explore these in year 2. But the diagram gets messier. As mentioned, argumentation, for example, is not confined to the philosophical lens. Argumentation is a tool that theology uses. It just looks a little different to how it might appear in philosophy. So, if you're thinking about choosing hermeneutical approaches for your assignment, please ensure that you don't conflate the method of hermeneutics with the lens of theology. And make sure not to conflate the strategy you've chosen, whether that's one we introduce you to today or something you come across in your wider reading, with hermeneutics as a broader method or theology as the overarching discipline. And at the same time, it's true for all of the disciplinary lenses and methods we'll be exploring this year. While we might examine the method and its related strategies in the context of a particular lens, many of these methods and their strategies are also employed by other lenses, although perhaps in slightly different ways and with slightly different intentions. Nothing ever fits neatly in a single box in RE. If you ever find yourself getting confused, you can come back to these slides to help. So let's move away from thinking about the assignment now and consider some of the benefits of teaching hermeneutics. Now you should have this research paper. If not, please just download it from Brightspace. Read pages 7 to 10 and just jot down your thoughts. Think about how maybe proof texting or binary arguments have crept into your own practice and the impact it might be having on religious diversity. And think about the benefits to teaching hermeneutics and maybe any obstacles as well. Now, to get us to think about the challenges of interpretation, take a look at this riddle. Do you know what the subject of the riddle is? Maybe pause and have a think. And then think what knowledge, skills or experiences pupils would need to have to begin to understand this riddle. So they'd need, for example, to be able to read the text, to understand vocabulary like pulp or strife or corruption. They'd need to know the story of the Garden of Eden. They'd have to understand concepts like sin and free will. And they'd have to understand the basics of human digestion as well. It's clear that before a pupil can interpret a text, they need to understand or comprehend it first. So how can teachers support their pupils to understand the text that they're asking them to engage with? In case you're wondering, the answer to that riddle was the fruit in the Garden of Eden. Now, there are several things you can incorporate into your classroom practice to support pupils' comprehension. The pitch of the text needs to be what Alex Quigley calls the Goldilocks degree of difficulty. Difficult, but just right. This is vital because if a text is too hard, the strategies that come after this may support pupils' understanding, but it's most likely their comprehension of the text will be poor. Alex Quigley talks about 8 different features that can determine the level of challenge a text will present. He calls these the arduous 8. Take a moment to read the main features that determine text difficulty in the diagram on the right hand side. Teachers then need to teach pupils the key vocabulary explicitly. We also need to support pupils' background knowledge of the text they read. For example, if they're reading a text from the Bible, we might want them to know the history of the Bible, how it was compiled, the genre of the text they're reading, its context, a bit about how it's been translated, and so on. Background knowledge is important for comprehension. Research also shows if you're reading about a topic you're familiar with, you're much more likely to understand the text compared to when reading a topic you're not familiar with at all. The intention here is to demonstrate exactly how much you need to teach your pupils before you can ask them to do any interpretation. We're going to return to this message periodically and ask you to reflect on it. We argue that hermeneutical approaches to teaching RE help make our subject more diverse and more inclusive. It, therefore, has a positive impact on our social justice mission. And just pause for a minute and think about how what you've learnt so far supports this statement. And at this point, we stop for some questions. If you have any questions, please jot them down and do speak to your SDL. And then we pause for a 20-minute break, and you might want to pause now as well and have a short break. It's been a lot to take in so far, and we're just leaving here our vision of RE that we shared with you at Institute on the screen. You might want to reflect on this while you have your break. Welcome back to session 2. We're going to look at how we put these strategies in practice. You're going to need resources 2 and 3, which are on Brightspace, and we are going to be exploring 2 specific hermeneutical strategies, Dialogue and LASMO, and we're going to think about how they might apply to your context. So before we can start to teach interpretation skills, we need to have sufficient subject knowledge about the context of text and the academic debate surrounding them. And scholars like Bowie and Cooling and Pett suggest that when studying sacred texts, we should place them at the centre of the unit of work, not simply as extracts on the periphery. For many RE departments, this will require a big shift in practice. Some of you will be teaching in schools that are leading the charge. Others of you will have to settle for smaller incremental changes for now. As you grow into your role as teacher and subject leader, you can start influencing these decisions more directly. We then need to plan enough time within our lessons to allow questioning of the text we use in teaching, to expose pupils to the paradox, mystery and controversy surrounding them. And we should be cautious about using quotations to prove points or to construct black and white oppositional arguments, even if our exam specifications seem to be encouraging us to do exactly this. Sounds great, but what strategies can we use when teaching interpretation? Let me introduce you to Dawn Cox's work. Dawn, who sadly died earlier this year, was a head of RE in a London school and a prolific blogger. And she's also the co-author of Making Every RE Lesson Count. She designed a tool to help teachers plan their approach to teaching pupils to read and interpret texts, and her work was peer-reviewed and published as part of Edge Hill University's Excellent Summer School series in 2021. It's a versatile strategy that can be used with texts from any worldview, so let's dig in. Dialogue, which Dawn designed, offers a series of prompts to help teachers plan for textual studies. So we have debates. What debates are there about this text, or what debates does it raise? Impact. What effect has this text had? What do people believe or do, etc. because of it? Audience. Who's the text intended for, and does that make a difference? And lens. How might this text be viewed by people with different worldviews? For example, a Sunni Muslim, a feminist, a Christian, etc. And origin. Where did this text come from? This might raise questions about reliability, for example. And genre. So what type of text is this? The teacher might not choose to delve into each of these elements with their pupils. They might choose just one or two to look at for each text and adapt which elements and how many elements they need to look at to meet the needs of different classes and pupils. So let's look at one example from Dawn herself. In this example, which is aimed at a Year 8 class, the teacher will have taught the pupils what is known about origin and audience. This will help the pupils to interpret the text correctly. The teacher then explored lens, genre and debates to support pupils' interpretation of the text. Dawn has broken down each prompt with scaffolding questions to help pupils explore the text in more depth. The questions also prompt the reader to think about what they, the reader, are bringing to the text and to focus on how subjective this is. Notice that the teacher has not used all of the dialogue prompts to help manage cognitive load for pupils, but still allows pupils to make connections, comparisons, and contrasts. Now, this was a task that everybody did on their tables, but you can have a read through this text on your own and to think about what you've learnt about the text before, how different Christians might approach it, etc., etc. Now, hopefully, we're wanting you to feel that you felt supported and guided and able to make connections more quickly because of these prompts. And that in turn is what you want to introduce into your classroom when asking pupils to analyse an unfamiliar text. It's important to note that your pupils won't always be able to answer these questions, and that's okay if you've planned accordingly. Before you ask pupils to engage in dialogue in a lesson, you must have completed the task you plan to give them yourself. Then you can work out whether you want pupils to recall the answer, deduce the answer, or whether you intend to teach them the answer during the lesson explicitly. If you want pupils to recall or deduce, make sure they have the required prior knowledge to do this. Secondly, the theologian Anthony Thiselton is clear that a text cannot be made to mean just anything. There are legitimate interpretations and others that are plainly just wrong if care is taken in reading the text. Taking care to avoid incorrect interpretations is very important. It's the job of the RE teacher to support pupils to learn to make justifiable interpretations and not just assume that all that matters is having an opinion. So, now we know a little bit about dialogue, it's time for you to have a go at it yourself. So pause for about 20 minutes and use dialogue to plan some structured questions to support pupils in interpreting this text. Have a particular class in mind as you plan. If you're teaching another text in the coming weeks and wish to do that text instead, feel free. Once you've done that, answer the questions yourself and then, with your particular class in mind, decide whether they will recall or deduce the answers or whether you will need to teach the answers explicitly. At this point, we pause for some feedback, so again, make a note of any comments or questions and speak to your SDL. So there are many ways you can adapt dialogue for your context. For example, when planning to teach a religious text in the classroom, answer the dialogue prompts yourself so you have enough subject knowledge to teach it. Very important. When teaching a religious text, you might just introduce the context. You might choose a couple of the prompts to teach explicitly and then explore with pupils. Or you could really invest in the strategy and at the start of a schema work, teach pupils the prompts explicitly and then explore a variety of texts using the prompts over a series of lessons. So now it's time for you to have a little think and evaluate this method. So reflect on those questions in the yellow boxes and just jot down your responses. And once again, there was time for some feedback. You know what I'm going to say. If you have any questions or comments, please jot them down and speak to your SDL. Our next practical strategy is another acronym, LASMO. Dr. Margaret Carswell carried out research using this approach with staff in Australia, and it was filtered down to students. Teachers reported that their pupils' use of the Bible and their understanding has improved remarkably. The process begins by teaching the literary form of the chosen passage, noting the text structure and purpose and the kind of truths the form conveys. The teacher will then teach pupils who scholars think were the author and audience of the writing and what was happening at the time it was written. In considering what the author wrote, pupils are also directed to attend to the way the author wrote. Are words or phrases repeated? If dialogue and contrast are used, how are they used? Does the text allude to other ideas, storylines, events, and texts? Is there figurative language, and does it imply that the meaning is more than just what is obvious at the surface level? The S focuses on the world, the passage, and if needed, the entire text is set in, both geographically and in time. It notes the role and function of characters and highlights any cultural or religious practices present in the passage. At this point, learning about the text ends, and attention to what this knowledge should enable comes in. The teacher should encourage discussion about what the author might have been trying to say to their community about, for example, God, people, and the world. And finally, the LASMO structure asks pupils to consider how might those in our world, people of faith or no faith, respond to this passage now. Although LASMO was developed to use within the context of Christianity, we'll look at an example using a Hindu parable to show it can be adapted to work with a range of different worldviews. So, just a reminder, there is the LASMO structure. Let's think about how this might be taught to a group of pupils. So pause for a second to read the first part of the parable of the man in the well on the right. So if I was being the teacher now, I'm going to go into the game, and this is what I might say. So, the man in the well is a parable. This means that the story didn't literally happen, but the aim of the story is to convey a message. The parable is found in the Mahabharata, traditionally ascribed to being told by Vidura around the 400 BC to 200 CE mark. It's regarded as a text about Hindu moral law and a history of what happened. The setting is fictional, but many of the elements in the story represent certain ideas related to Hinduism. The dense forest is the mystery of rebirth from which it's difficult to get away. The beasts are mental and physical diseases that frighten men. The dreadful-looking woman is the decay of old age that destroys one's beauty, and the well is the human body in which the soul hangs. The dragon in the well is all-devouring time, which takes everything away from human beings, and the creeper that grows across the middle of the well represents the desires of the embodied soul to stay alive. The drops of honey are sensual enjoyments. So, now we know something about the literary form, the audience and the author, and the setting, let's have a go at interpretation. What might be the meaning of this text, and what might this mean for our world today? So, pause, have a think, jot down your thoughts. So, it's an allegory of human existence. And for our world today, the relevance is that when we forget the inevitability of diseases, old age, and the ultimate destruction of the human body, we occupy ourselves in accumulating sensual enjoyment which we may never truly enjoy. The man who is surrounded by dangers from all sides but forgets the imminent threat and enjoys the pleasure of drinking the trickling honey. Similarly, the soul in human body is deluded by the desire of pleasure. So let's think about what knowledge pupils would have to deduce meaning from this text and relate it to our world today. Well, they'd have to have good comprehension of the text. They'd need to know what a Brahmin is, and they'd need to understand Hindu concepts such as samsara, moksha, Atman, and artha. So there's quite a lot to unpick there. So as with dialogue, pupils need to have a lot of prior knowledge of a religion before they can start to interpret. If you want pupils to recall or deduce during a LASMO activity, Make sure the pupils have the required prior knowledge to do this. And again, remember that a text cannot be made to mean just anything. There are legitimate interpretations and others that are just plainly wrong. Care needs to be taken when reading the text. So now you know about using LASMO, you'll have a chance to have a go at it yourself. So again, you might want to pause here. So you need to design an activity where you ask pupils to engage hermeneutically with the Sikh Mool mantra. Use LASMO to help you and have a particular class in mind as you plan. And follow the steps to help you with each part of it. So find out the answers to each element of LASMO yourself. Plan how you'll teach literary form, audience, author and setting. And plan how you will support pupils to deduce meaning and the implications for people of faith and no faith in our world today. And once you've had a go at it, we want you to think about your response to it. So read through the example of LASMO from the practice guide and have a look at the questions in the yellow box. Strengths, challenges, how you might be able to overcome them, and how you might be able to incorporate this in your planning this term. We want this to be really practical and of immediate use. And again, jot down any questions, comments, concerns, issues, and feel free to raise them with your SDL. Going to suggest you pause in a minute, but before you have that break, let's return to this idea that hermeneutical approaches to teaching RE help make our subject more diverse and inclusive. So think about how LASMO and dialogue help to do this. When we think about implementing a plan based on something we've read, it's really important to understand that features of it can be deceiving. So for example, we might see someone using booklets and think, that's a great idea, I'll try that, but it won't work. Why? Is that because booklets are a failure? Or because we fail to understand the construction of the school, the student discipline, and teacher lenses that have helped to make it work in that particular place? As Dylan Williams says, everything works somewhere, nothing works everywhere. We have to become critical and reflective, not just of ideas and concepts, but also the underlying structures that make it possible for something to work. We have to seek to constantly question and understand what's working and what makes that happen. How can I apply that to my own practice? And this is what it means to be a critical teacher. So pause again and think about the key issues here, the advantages and disadvantages, and how these approaches might fit within the infrastructure, booklets, homeworks, rhythm routines that you might need to embed this kind of thinking in your lessons or in the curriculum. And as usual, note down any responses you might want to share. And just a very important note here before we go into session 3 regarding your assignments. You'll be asked to choose either hermeneutics or CRE as a practical strategy to try. Now, CRE is looked at in detail in Training Day 2, and it's also covered during Self-Study 3. But although it comes later, don't let this put you off choosing this strategy if it's of interest to you. It's a non-confessional, so it may not be appropriate for a faith school context, and realist approach to the teaching of RE developed over the past 20 years. The father of CRE is Andrew Wright, one of the co-authors of this book. To paraphrase his work, the approach is grounded in the belief that controversial issues should be discussed openly, and that this can help pupils to become religiously literate. There is an idea that an objective truth exists, and that our knowledge of the world is built upon informed judgments. Pupils are asked to consider variation between different worldviews and to consider disputed truth claims. The hope is to empower them to be able to make informed judgments about the nature of reality and the impact this might have on their lives. If you're interested in CRE, this is the book that you need to start off with, Critical Religious Education in Practice. You should be able to access it through SHU, or you might want to talk to your department about possibly investing in a copy. But please don't be put off from choosing this. It can either be CRE or hermeneutics. If you want any further information, please talk to your SDL. And so now we go on to session 3. So far, we've taken a fairly traditional view of hermeneutics as the interpretation of texts, particularly sacred texts. But we can take a broader view. Interpretation can be any source. It could be a text, sacred or not. It could be artwork. It could be poetry. It could be music. And Great RE should help pupils read these kind of interpretations too, to read between the lines, even when there are no literal lines. So here's an example. Inference squares encourage pupils to extract as much meaning from an image as possible, gradually moving from the known, so what they can see, to the unknown. And you can also use this with short textual extracts. The previous example asked pupils to interpret a still photograph with relatively little in the way of intentionally created symbolism beneath it, yet it still required a huge amount of background knowledge for any pupil to make sense of it. And how much more true is that of complex artwork with its symbolism and layered meanings? RE teachers can be a bit afraid to use this in their lessons because they worry they don't have the credentials to interpret it correctly. But part of building religious literacy is helping our pupils become responsible interpreters of a whole range of sources, art and visual imagery included. One of the strengths of the hermeneutical approach is that it embraces the fact there is rarely a single uniform interpretation of any source, be it sacred, text, or visual art. And here's another strategy, questions for pupils to think about and discuss as they walk through a pop-up gallery. This might seem a little out of reach at this stage in your practice though, so you can start with what we're doing here. Have an example of a single image and questions for pupils to engage with. It could be a do now activity, or it could be a way to consolidate learning at the end of the lesson. So take 10 minutes now to reflect on these questions of the image on the screen. Just have a little reflection time and see how you feel after completing the activity. And then if you pause here, you can read the background to the image that you've just thought about. You started off by looking at the image, and then you read the expert's interpretation of it. How does that change your perspective? How does the extra context change the way you see the image? What difference would it have made if you'd been given this information before discussing the image? Similar to our inference square, you can see how providing explanation and context can sometimes help with interpretation, but it can sometimes hinder it. Part of our job as RE teachers is making the judgment call about what to disclose and when. Moving from techniques that get pupils thinking about big ideas to those that get them focusing on the little details, let's look at annotation and guided writing. When we use and interpret sacred texts in the classroom, it's important that pupils have the opportunity to discuss them, pick out keywords and phrases, and think about what they might mean. This exercise needs to have time dedicated to it. As you can see from the example on the left, the pupils have highlighted keywords and annotated this text, Surah 1. Some words are unfamiliar to them, such as merciful or astray, and we can see they've annotated what these mean. Other annotations relate to words and phrases they think are important to help them understand the texts, such as Master of the Day of Judgment, which they have interpreted as meaning boss of the day when people are judged. Looking at the example on the right, the teacher has provided some guidance, asking the pupils to choose between words and phrases that are central to the text and why. The teacher has then pointed them towards a key phrase and asked them to think about what a Muslim might understand by guide us along a straight path. Finally, they've been asked to consider what the text tells them about what Muslims believe God is like, using some key words from the text to help them. These two very simple techniques have made a complex text more manageable for pupils to access, understand, and interpret. And similarly, in this example, we can see the power of highlighting and annotating passages to develop understanding. Any questions or comments, please write them down now. So just take some time to evaluate this approach, strengths and weaknesses and challenges. Is it something that you might want to use in your practice? We obviously took feedback on the day, but we'd be very keen to hear your feedback in your one-to-one interactions. So again, pause and think how taking a more creative approach to interpretation might help foster diversity and inclusion in the RE classroom. At this point, we pause for lunch, which you might want to do now, or at least a comfort break. And welcome back to the last session, all about Level 7 research. Take a second to read the objectives, maybe pause here. So the overarching question for your PGCE assignment is, what does it mean to be a great teacher of RE? And a key focus for your assignment and practice this year is going to be on addressing the core misconception that lies at the heart of so much of what we've outlined above, that religions and worldviews are monolithic, homogeneous and unchanging. And you'll focus on tackling this misconception using one of the following approaches: hermeneutical or critical RE. Now, becoming a critical and reflective teacher of the subject is a 4-stage process, and you can see how our curriculum combines to help you achieve it. We see this model expressed in the Kolb cycle. In this final session, we're going to take some time looking at the Module 1 subject assignment for the year. So let's begin with looking at the structure of the assignments. You are going to do a research proposal, you are going to submit a sample of your assignment, and then you are going to submit your final assignment. Today we're going to really focus on the research proposal. But to do this effectively, you do need to consider the overall assignment and plan when you're going to complete the literature review and your teaching episodes, and also ensure you have enough time before the final submission to complete the reflection section. This is an example from last year, just so you have a overview of when everything happened. So note these dates are from last year, but it's just a suggested time frame to support the completion of the assignment. It's just to support your workload and to help you reach that final submission point in May. So the first 2 points when you hand in your research proposal and your sample of work are a chance to gain feedback on your work so far. So this should give you an idea of what you should have completed at a given time within the year. So the proposals are in around November time, the sample early next year, and then the final submission. Do not leave writing the whole assignment to the last part of term 4 or term 5, because at this point you're going to have module 2 work to do and you're going to be prepping for QTS. So do try and work steadily through it. So at this point, if you haven't done already, please can you download the assignment guidance. So Thomas identifies 4 main reasons why we do research in education. You might have an idea that you want to pursue it for its own sake. You might be curious about something. You might have noticed something or want to understand more about classroom practice. If you ever thought, that's odd, or I wonder why that happens, then it's in this camp. You might want to see if something is effective. A program or suggestion might be introduced and you might want to see what the impact is. What are the key outcomes? Did whatever it is work? You might be interested in systematically exploring the impact of a particular project, experiment or source. Finally, you might be focused on an aspect of your own practice or someone else's to see if there's elements to improve. And here you'd introduce a new way of working, thinking and talking about events as they happen, and collect information about how these ways of thinking and talking can change events. And this is called action research. Now you're strongly advised to focus this assignment on pupils in Key Stage 3. This is because you're likely to have a greater degree of flexibility. For this assignment, you must be able to adapt or independently plan sequences of learning rather than simply teach materials that have been prepared by other teachers in school. So before you begin to identify a possible focus for this assignment, you're advised to speak with your mentor or another trusted subject expert on which topic or theme might be most suitable to consider for the purpose of this assignment. So what do we mean by classroom research? Well, it provides a useful methodology for starting any type of research that helps you reflect on your own practice. Hewson et al. Use research to help trainee teachers become reflective about what it means to teach for conceptual change. A useful outcome of this research showed that trainee teachers tended to focus on how pupils understood conceptions and understandings, which then supported their own teaching of conceptual changes in science. So research can improve not only your understanding of how RE should be taught, but also the concepts that underpin the ideas making up the RE curriculum. Research doesn't have to be a lengthy or laborious process. Being a trainee teacher is busy enough. Focus on a key aspect of teaching you may have observed within your department. Collect information about your pupils and any barriers or assets they bring to your classroom. And make a change in your practice based on what you've read from the literature, e.g. introduce LASMO to one of your classes. Collect evidence, and remember that qualitative evidence is just as valid in research, and evaluate the impact of your teaching approach. Consider how you know that your pupils have learned and made progress as opposed to simply completing the task or activity. And change your practice moving forward, because teaching is also about you as a critically reflective learner. And what do we mean by evidence? Well, we often assume evidence must be quantifiable data that can be plotted onto a graph. But often the data available is based on what you observe, see, and hear in your classroom. So, if it helps, have a notebook with you so that you can capture some of the evidence that will take place right in front of you. This might include pupil responses to your questions, pupils' work, pupils' feedback. Formative assessment activities, for example, will provide plenty of feedback on how their learning is developing. A reflective journal you might want to keep. Narratives. So colleagues might observe you, and through that you can gain perceptions of the dynamics of a classroom. And your planning and resources. You can use these to show your thinking behind how you planned a particular learning episode and what you were hoping your learning outcomes would be. So what does this mean for us in our assignment planning? A few points to note about ethics. The day-to-day practice is particularly important. This means you shouldn't be doing anything you wouldn't be doing as part of your normal teaching practice. So, for example, don't use pupil questionnaires or focus groups unless your school or department has these as part of their own quality assurance and evaluation exercises. The clearer you are about your intended impact or outcome, the easier it is to work out what evidence is worth collecting to measure this. For example, if I was interested in making a difference to pupil oracy, there'd be no purpose to me setting a written assignment and using this as evidence. And here are some approaches to reading. Just pause and have a read of this slide. And here is a critical reading grid as well that you might want to look at. If we want to understand the situation, our first question ought to be whether anyone else has explored this before. And this is where academic literature comes in. It's a way for people to communicate what they've explored or found out. You've been given a reading list within your RE assignment guidance, and it's essential to start with this. Your marker will expect you to show knowledge and understanding of the text on this list relevant to your focus. Focusing on the text in the assignment reading list will also make sure you are staying RE focused and not becoming too generic. Remember, this is an opportunity to dig into RE specific approaches and strategies. Once you feel you've exhausted what the reading list has to offer for your chosen focus, you might use a tool like Google Scholar to explore more widely, or you may find that your initial reading points you in the direction of other sources. As you explore, remember you don't need to read every last word. Efficiency is the key. There are different ways to quickly pull what you need from books, articles, and online sources. And make sure you always make a note or save a link to your sources so you can refer to them correctly and avoid plagiarizing. Finally, make sure you're reading actively and critically by using these kinds of questions to frame your encounter with the text. And so now we'll go on to think about your research proposal. So why are we asking you to write a proposal? Why not just get stuck into the assignments? Well, a research proposal sets out your key thinking on what you want to find out, how you know the context of this, how you're going to test it, does it seem reasonable and feasible, and the aim is to make sure your study plan's as effective as possible for what you want to achieve. We don't want you to waste time chasing down rabbit holes. It helps you to structure your planning and thinking supportively and to make sure you're set up for successful studies. So the research proposal is about 1,000 words, give or take 10%, and it's going to help you see where you're going. And if you invest early, you'll reap the rewards later. The first step is formalising your thoughts to produce this proposal. It helps to begin with the end. You can see the research project from conception to completion, and it supports you in planning for intent, implementation and impact, which are the goals we're striving for within the focus of this research. Lastly, and just as important, it supports your workload. You might go on to create a detailed work plan that holds you accountable to steps and dates within your research, but this research proposal is step one of that detailed planning process. The proposal proforma is basically a grid consisting of questions which are designed to prompt your thinking, and you'll complete it using bullet points. And remember, this is all speculative at this moment. You may change your mind later, but the idea is to get your university markers feedback on your ideas sooner rather than later. There are some questions to help you define the focus of your assignment. Just have a look at them here. And the next 3 steps are questions about implementing your project. So pause now and just start jotting down your initial ideas. We're not expecting you to be in a position to be able to complete your proposal yet. You need time to think, read and discuss with your support network. And we hope today's sessions will have already given you some ideas. So this is a guide with last year's dates, but it is just a guide for you. So please do find out what this year's dates are. They will be in your assignment guidance. So you submit your proposal on Brightspace, your SDL will read it through, let you know when the feedback is ready, and you will have a supportive chat about it. This was a group reflection, but you can try it on your own. So just think about how hermeneutical approaches help to make our REIT more diverse and more inclusive, and this might be the strategy that you want to focus on for your assignment. And then we want to make everything practical, so please think about how you can use what you've heard today in your classroom in the short, medium and long term. So pause here and have a look at today's objectives. And all that remains to be said is thank you so much for listening.